Okay, I think we could start now, just to welcome everyone to this first beginning of academic year lecture for the Department of Politics and International Relations. Welcome first of all to all our new students, both those starting a bachelor's degree and those starting a master's degree. A big welcome back as well to those who are continuing students, our continuing master's students and continuing second and third year undergraduate students. And I'm really delighted to start off the academic year with this lecture by Professor Anatol Lieven. And he'll be talking about the radicalisation of the US Republican right, which is a particularly apposite moment, I think, to be talking and thinking about this with the US elections. Anatol Lieven is Chair of International Relations at the War Studies Department at King's College, London. Unlike most academics, he's actually spent a life outside of academia, and for over 2 decades he was a journalist in South Asia and in the former Soviet Union. His actual experience in South Asia has led him to publish recently in 2011 a very well-received, a very impressive volume on Pakistan called Pakistan, the Hard Country. For anyone wanting to understand Pakistan, that is an excellent book to start with. Whilst he was a journalist in the former Soviet Union, when I got to know him a bit, he followed events with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Firstly in the Baltic states, where his family has its origins, and wrote a book in 1994 on the Baltic Revolution, which was about the emergence of the new Baltic states. And then he was very much involved, not as a combatant, but as a commentator on the Chechen War from 1994 to 1996, and wrote one of the most important and significant books on Chechnya, called Chechnya, the Tombstone of Russian Power, in 1998. In the mid-2000s, he then moved to the United States, and he was there a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And during that period, he wrote what was to be a very significant but also quite controversial, for his own career as well, controversial book about US nationalism. And it was entitled America, Right and Wrong, an Anatomy of American Nationalism. And the first edition of that came out in 2005, and he has just updated it for 2012, and he is holding the book at the present time, which can be found soon in all good bookshops. And clearly he has been thinking very much about the dynamics of what has been happening in the United States. And I think this topic is also one which is both significant both for understanding domestic politics, for understanding politics within the United States, but also for understanding international politics, because clearly whatever happens in the US elections has profound impact upon international politics. And many of the key issues and debates are related to international relations. So I'm really very pleased to welcome Anatol to give this initial beginning of year lecture.
Thank you so much, Roland. It's very kind of you to invite me, and I'm, of course, delighted to be here in order, yes, to publicise the new edition of the book, which is indeed coming out in a couple of weeks' time. If any of you were thinking that it's a little odd to have specialised, or indeed still to specialise simultaneously, in Pakistan, the former Soviet Union, and the United States, you would be entirely correct. It is a little odd. The problem is that as a former journalist and think tank person, all these subjects follow me around like tin cans tied to a dog's tail. And of these, the biggest tin can, which will never leave me, or indeed anyone else, is of course the United States. One reason being that what the United States does and thinks has a direct impact on all the others as well. So I spend half my time by now, when I'm thinking about Pakistan, thinking about what the United States may do with regard to Pakistan. Less so with regard to Russia, of course, but even there to a degree. I hope that this lecture bridges the two sort of sectors in the audience, because it's going to be mainly about US politics and political culture, appealing, I hope, to the politics section of the audience, but of course with direct implications for American foreign policy. And the genesis of the book was really that in the wake of 9/11 and looking at the US response to 9/11, and particularly the way in which the Bush administration was able to generate widespread support, sometimes in some rather surprising places in the United States, for the invasion of Iraq, I became interested in the deeper background, the roots of this reaction in US history and in US political culture. And the more I dug into this, the more fascinated I became by these deeper and older patterns in the United States. And one of the things that struck me very much from the beginning was that, less so perhaps today, but when I was writing the book, and for a number of years afterwards, and yes, even today in odd corners of academia and government, you do find this line that culture doesn't matter, you know, that culture is secondary, unimportant, you know, including, especially when it comes to policy, in the areas of state building and development and so on. I've found rather fewer people arguing this since our recent, not wholly successful, operations in Afghanistan, for example, and elsewhere, where culture does appear to matter. But the thing that always struck me as particularly odd was, at least after I got to know the United States, that much of this line about the unimportance of culture was predicated, explicitly or more often implicitly, on an idea of an undifferentiated modernity. Essential modernity as the norm was the assumption behind this. Modernity as the goal, if you like, to which humanity naturally proceeds. And that in turn was based more often on the unconscious and implicit belief in the United States as the paradigm of modernity, of successful modernity. Well, of course, it doesn't take, I think, a very deep or sophisticated view of the United States to see that this is a country in whose politics culture matters enormously. Historical culture, inherited culture. Not, of course, unchanging culture, but nonetheless certain traditions where you can trace an organic continuity back to the American past, and often to a pretty distant past. And this is true, I came to feel, of both the main aspects or currents of American nationalism that I explored in the book and that I'm going to explore further today, although I will talk less about nationalism as such and more about radical conservatism in the context of especially the present US presidential election campaign and the Republican Party. Because on the one hand, and perhaps, well, obviously, most clearly, the tremendous importance of conservative religion in the United States in politics, on the one hand, is something which has come up in, it must be said, yes, to a considerable degree, new forms over the past 40 years, and has come to play, as I think every observer of the United States must recognise, a tremendously important role in the politics of the right, and also in the polarisation of US politics, with very grave consequences for government and government policy in America. But equally, if you look at the cultural and indeed the theological, historical and social roots of this conservative religious tradition in the US, you can trace them back not just to the beginnings of the American Republic, not just even to the foundation of the English colonies in America in the early 17th century, but beyond that to 16th century England and Scotland, from where the colonists came. Once again, not an unchanging tradition, obviously, but one where you can trace continuities. However, so that on the one hand, I looked in this book at some of these deeply culturally specific conservative traditions in US political culture. And I called this, for reasons I will come to later, this complex of issues, the American nationalist antithesis. What I call the American nationalist thesis, on the other hand, because I took that to be, in a way, the official or semi-official or consensual version of American nationalism, appears at first sight to be a highly modern and new thing. And that is the American civic nationalist belief in democracy, in democratic institutions, and in America as the exemplar of these institutions. Something which, if not wholly new, certainly it does seem to indicate America as the exemplar and leader of a successful modernity. But what I think the Tea Parties in America have made clear, and what I observed much earlier, was that this civic nationalist belief in American institutions is also has, well, two things. One is it's imbued with very specific aspects of American culture, and of course a quasi-religious belief in the United States and American institutions. Now, for anyone who has observed the Tea Parties, this must be absolutely obvious. This creedal belief, not just in democracy, we all believe in, I hope, but in the specific institutions of the United States, which a good many of the leaders of the Tea Parties have explicitly referred to as God-given. In other words, not the work of a specific group of American, late 18th century American oligarchs with particular class interests, which they reflected in this constitution, but actually as a product of eternal natural law, and often as handed down by the hand of God himself to Jefferson and company, leading in turn, of course, to the belief which marks America out very strongly from most of the rest of the Western world, that as a quasi-religious text, the American Constitution cannot be changed. Even though, of course, it has been changed quite considerably in the past through amendments. But now there is this categorical belief that it is unchangeable, and that the solution to America's current problems lies in a fundamentalist return to the letter of the Constitution. If you look at Tea Party propaganda, this is the one thing which unites them all. And the Tea Parties, of course, while they have not conquered the Republican Party in terms of actually nominating the Republican candidate, they have had a tremendous effect in recent years in changing the Republican Party. And they've done so as the latest wave of radical conservatism over the past 40 years, which has, as some of you may have read recently in the newspapers, let alone in scholarly articles, turned the Republican Party and the Republican program into something really very, very different from what it was 30 years ago. It's been remarked that Ronald Reagan, who was seen at the time as representing a wave of conservative change within the party, that Reagan's program of 1980 in the elections then is Obama's program today in terms of spirit. Whereas the Republican program of today would be unrecognizable to many of the Republicans of the past. I had a sort of insight into this change from Eisenhower's granddaughter, who's a friend of mine in Washington, who declared that she was voting, she's voted Democrat in the last two elections. Well, especially the last election for Obama, and she'll vote this time. And has she broken with the party? No, she says the party has broken with her. And Obama, she says, is governing as an Eisenhower Republican. An index, once again, of how far the Republican Party has, in fact, moved. But also, I think, an indication that in the this fanatical attachment to the US Constitution, there is something which marks America out culturally from other parts of the Western and democratic world. This brings me back again to a point which I think has been very much obscured by this idea of America as the quintessential modern country. That, in many respects, America is in fact a very old country. The Constitution, with the possible exception of Switzerland, but I don't think so, is by far the oldest constitution in the world, and the Western world. The US political parties are the oldest continuous political parties in the world. And other aspects of American political culture, too, go back a very long way. An interesting man to read in this regard is Samuel Huntington. I would not necessarily recommend that you should read him, of course, but necessarily want to agree with him in what he says, you know, about the clash of civilizations and so forth, because I don't think he gets the world outside America, or got, he's the late Samuel Huntington, of course, got the world outside America very well at all. But some of the things that he said about the United States have been, I think, deeply insightful. Provocative, one doesn't have to agree with them completely, but they certainly make you think. And one of those lines is that the United States has an essentially early modern or Tudor political system. Because in Huntington's view, the US Constitution, of course, was drawn up at the end of the 18th century, but it was drawn up on the basis, of course, of US representative and judicial forms, which went back a century and a half or more before that, and, of course, derived directly from England of the early 17th century. England in those years was still in the early stages of a move towards much more effective, centralised, unified modern government, which on the continent of Europe you saw exemplified by royal autocracy in the 18th century, which was then carried on by the subsequent states, and in England in Britain was summed up in the phrase, the king or the queen in parliament. In other words, an autocracy now embodied in the parliamentary majority, but exercised by the government. Huntington's view was that America came before that, in many ways, and that America had inherited many of the attitudes of a medieval England, where it was all about checking and balancing government power and not changing laws and introducing new laws. Magna Carta, foundation ultimately of democracy in many ways, but drawn up by a bunch of barons, of course, under the slogan, non volumus mutare leges Angliae. We do not want to change the laws of England. Why? Well, because the existing laws suit us very well, thank you very much. And we don't want the king to have more power. And Huntington suggested that the immense web of checks, of balances, of restrictions, which so much of the time limit what an American government can do, actually which limit what an American parliament can do as well, derive essentially from this medieval tradition. And certainly I think we've seen in recent years the tremendous capacity of these checks and balances, at least in circumstances of deep political polarization, to block what, perhaps in other countries, would have been seen as a very strong democratic mandate for change. But in America, it has been often remarked now, you only need a substantial minority of a minority party to be able to block a great deal in the US Senate in particular. This, of course, in turn, is closely related to the fact that America is naturally a federal system with great power for the states. But I mentioned Huntington because I wanted to bring out, once again, the tremendous importance of history and tradition in explaining and understanding patterns in the United States today. Now, I'll sort of start with what I called in the book the American civic nationalist thesis. The underpinnings of this, which really brings out the long before the Tea Parties, or a century before the Tea Parties, I think, the phrase the American Creed, coined originally by G.K. Chesterton, a Brit, but then adopted by a great many Americans as an explanation of features of the American political system and American political culture. And the word creed, of course, was precisely intended to indicate a quasi-religious faith in the American system and in the institutions of American democracy and the judicial system. And remarked, well, actually, long before the phrase itself was coined, was remarked by Tocqueville in the 1830s and by many since then, that the omnipresence and the force of these beliefs in America makes, in certain respects, for a degree of conformism, even an enforced conformism, in American political culture and society, which many autocratic regimes could only dream of. Tocqueville was struck that you could actually say more in a quasi-autocratic France in the 1830s on certain subjects, especially when it came to religion, by the way, than you could in the democratic United States of the time. It's particularly true, of course, when emotions in America are raised by the perception that America and the American system are under attack by some outside force. And this term, the American Creed, and the patterns that it leads to, were then greatly analysed and remarked by a generation of American scholars whose work I explicitly wanted to recall and publicise in this book in the 1950s, reacting to McCarthyism and the wave of chauvinist hysteria in the United States in the early 1950s, but not, as one would have found elsewhere in the world, explicitly behind authoritarianism, an anti-democratic spirit, but a chauvinism in defence of liberal democracy, of the Constitution, a cracking down on democratic freedoms in the name of democratic freedoms. Now, there are some authors who've written about this who are still very well known. The greatest and most famous of them, Richard Hofstadter, who wrote The Paranoid Style in American Politics, amongst other things. Some, interestingly, have been almost completely forgotten. Of these, the greatest is Lewis Hartz, who wrote in the mid-1950s The Liberal Tradition in America, one of the most perceptive analyses of the American political tradition ever written, almost forgotten today. I sometimes think because it has some very uncomfortable things to say. Its anniversary in 2006 passed unnoticed outside very narrow sections of academia. And the creedal meaning, the fanaticism of this belief in the US Constitution and US democratic institutions is summed up in a great phrase of Hartz's, that even a good idea can be a little bit dangerous when it's the only idea a person has ever had. There's another good phrase by Hofstadter on this, which is, he says that it has been our fate as a nation not to have ideologies, but to be one. In other words, the idea that America embodies democracy. Not that democracy is an important aspect of America, but that America is democracy. And you have to believe in this to be an American. And of course, historically, and in a way semi-officially, the idea is that you become an American by adopting the values of the American creed, believing in American institutions, and of course, following them, respecting the law, participating in democratic elections. This was an idea that became even stronger in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, partly as a result of the Civil War, represented, of course, for the North, the victory of these ideals over a retrograde and anti-democratic South. Not the South agreed, but anyway. but also very much and very explicitly was promoted in the later 19th century and early 20th century as a way of integrating and assimilating the enormous waves of immigrants who came in at that time, and came in, at least so it was feared by the older Americans of the time, from countries and cultures which did not necessarily value these institutions and had no experience of them. Something which, of course, remains very true today. And when I was criticised, as I often was in the United States, for using the term nationalism to describe America, I said, look, hang on a second. For 70 years, not merely was it common to use the term American nationalism, but it was generally accounted a very good thing. This wasn't a pejorative description. The progressive movement in America talked openly about the need to build up a modern American nationalism. Teddy Roosevelt did the same. Once again, precisely as a way of turning these great waves of Americans, of new Americans, into Americans. And guess what? It worked. This was one feature of it. Of course, it was also naturally backed by something I'll come to in a second. The growth of prosperity, the tremendous economic advantages of America, the American dream for these immigrants. But explicit belief in the American system as relentlessly preached by the American educational system and the media was of great importance in integration. And this is something which the Americans, often say we need to develop in Europe when it comes to our current problems, when it comes to assimilating immigrants. We need what the Germans call, but in America it's far, far stronger, Verfassungspatriotismus. We need a nationalist belief in the values and the institutions of democracy in the country. This is the civic nationalist side of America, and I make parallels here, which I fear didn't please either of the countries concerned, between America and France in this regard. That you've had since the French Revolution, a belief that French nationalism consists of belief in French institutions and the values of the Republic. Now, interestingly, as with American civic nationalist values, these values in France are taken to be universal. They are universal human values. They're applicable to all mankind. Immigrants who come to America and believe in these institutions become automatically Americans. And here you come to Bush's ability to co-opt support from some surprising places in America before the Iraq War. And America has not just the right and the duty, but the ability to go out and spread these values elsewhere in the world. Now, the notion that America can do this by force has not always been there. It's sort of come and gone and come and gone. But the notion that America can spread it by force of example and that all mankind can adopt these values is a very, very old one in American culture. Now, that brings me to the next part, what I called in the book the American nationalist antithesis. Because less stated, less formal than in France, but nonetheless, as in France, there has also always been a strain of thought which, in America, it doesn't contradict the first line as it has in France, but it has said or at least it's believed some of the same things, which is, this isn't enough. Now, in France, of course, for many, many years, not today to the same extent, you had a radical rightist opposition to this, which said no. Well, I mean, it was opposed to the values and the institutions of the Republic in principle, unlike in America. But it also said, to be French, it's not enough to believe in French institutions. You have to be culturally French, which in the past meant Catholic. And it was always, of course, deeply imbued, this tradition, with anti-Semitism. Today, that line is above all anti-Muslim, of course. But the notion being it's not enough to believe in democracy, to vote, to believe in the rule of law, it requires something else. And in America, now the interesting thing is that unlike in France and elsewhere, and this is something which a number of scholars, including Gunnar Myrdal, remarked, Unlike in Europe, this tradition is not explicitly anti-democratic. In fact, it's not democratic at all. It stresses its belief in the Republic, in democratic institutions and so forth. But it believes that they need to be limited, participation in them needs to be limited to people who have the culture to participate in them. Now, this is related very strongly in the American tradition, of course, to hostility to the Native Americans and to the blacks. Closely related to the idea that certain categories of people cannot exercise the rights of American citizens and cannot be offered those rights because they would use those rights to attack and destroy us. And were fascinating and explicit exchanges about this, above all in the 19th century, between people on the frontier and some people on the East Coast, liberals on the East Coast saying, look, we've signed treaties with the Indians, guaranteeing them certain things, and in any case, they live in this country, we've got to sort of basically bring them into our system. And people in the frontier say, you know nothing about this. If we give these people an inch, if we extend them the protection of the law, the next thing we'll all be scalped. The only good Indian is a dead Indian, something which is not written into the United States Constitution formally, but which was in effect part of the constitution of frontier states for a very long time, let me tell you. And so, running along the alongside the civic nationalist tradition, you have this other tradition which stresses its adherence to American values, but which also stresses a deep hostility to outsiders who this tradition holds cannot share those values and shouldn't be offered them because it's too dangerous for us. Now, and of course, this tradition, which I flowed into the radical conservative tradition in America, is closely, intimately related to this constant fear in every generation of core white groups in the country, that they are in danger of swamping, elimination by others. Now, of course, the fascinating thing about this is, and this is why one should never portray these tendencies as in any way unchanging, is of course that as time went on, one new set, at least for a great many years, of white immigrants after another was assimilated to the American core, and of course in many cases then adopted the same chauvinism, above all of course to people who were racially different, Native Americans, blacks, and of course, especially in California, Chinese and Japanese. And so then replicated. They became part of the core and then they replicated the hostility to the outsiders. And adopting this hostility was in some cases an integral part of the assimilation. There's a very good book about this process among the Irish in the 19th century by Noel Ignatieff, which is entitled How the Irish Became White. And how the Irish became white was, of course, by stressing their hostility to the blacks. Something which it was very necessary for the Irish to do, because when the Irish, poor, illiterate, Gaelic-speaking, and horror of horrors, Catholic, started arriving in large numbers in America from the 1830s on, you know what they were widely called? Sorry to use the phrase, not my phrase, of course, but it's indicative. White niggers. You know, an expression of absolute contempt and exclusion. How did the Irish get out of this? Well, obviously by making money, by making their way into the political system, but also by stressing their hatred of others, you know, that we're part of. And I think it was from the Irish world that became this American phrase, you know, for somebody who's good, you're a white man. You know, we're all whites together, so even if I'm a Catholic, even if, you know, I'm poor, we're at one because we're hostile to the outsiders, to the others. And so, wave after wave is assimilated and then replicates the fear from outside, the fear of being swamped. So that's the racial aspect of this, which has become more muted over the years, but is still very much there. Today, of course, you can see it in some of the response to Barack Obama. You can also see it, of course, in the tremendous fear today in certain parts of America of Latino immigration from Mexico. Now, by no means the same as this, but feeding into it, this racial paranoia. By the way, sorry, I won't look it up, but one should not exaggerate this line about the Irish being racially different. I quote from the late 18th century this wonderful passage from Benjamin Franklin, which makes you wonder a bit about how far he'd actually travelled, saying that there are basically just two white nations in the world. It's the English and some of the Germans. All the others, he says, are more or less swarthy, including the Swedes. I suppose there weren't many Swedes in America now, but I mean, that says something about how people at that stage saw assimilation. They didn't, I mean, assimilation of Swedes? Italians, let's not even go there. I'm sorry to say, I told this story in Washington. One time I thought somebody might laugh. It was one of the moments when nobody laughed. You don't make jokes about Benjamin Franklin in Washington. Anyway, yes, so assimilation, difficult. One aspect of what Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics and of the radical conservative tradition. The other one of tremendous importance, except for a few decades where it seemed to go away in the 20th century, is of course conservative religion. And here, once again, it is so striking. Not that America is in any way an outlier in the world as a whole. I always say, the problem about so much of modern sociology is not they say God is dead. I mean, we'll discover that for ourselves sooner or later. It's that they've said God is dead and Max Weber has replaced him. In other words, Max Weber's line about the disenchantment of the world, the inevitable collapse of religion as a part of, economic modernity and modernization, is true for everybody everywhere in the world. That is today manifestly not the case. America here is in no way an outlier. But of course it certainly is very different from Europe and from some of the other European colonies. I've just come back from Australia. In certain respects, as a sort of frontier society, there are aspects of America that the Australians understand very well, but they don't get the conservative religious thing at all. That's very, very strange to them. And I won't go into why America has preserved this when others haven't. I think one must simply accept it as a given, since it's always been there. And by the way, when I say that it seemed to go away for a few decades in the middle 20th century, I'm saying that it went away politically. It didn't have, it wasn't very visible politically. I'm not saying that it went away socially or culturally in large parts of the country, because it didn't. It's just that for a variety of reasons it was no longer expressed in the way that it had been, for example, all the way up to Prohibition, where conservative religion played a tremendous part in driving that through. And by the way, Prohibition, as anyone who studied it knows, was also intimately related to fear of immigration, Irish, German, Jewish, and so forth, and a way of basically showing the immigrants their place, that this is still a conservative Protestant country with the values of small town and rural America. Now, of course, since the 1960s, conservative religion has played a more and more visible part in the United States and has become associated with the Republican Party. Important to note, that was not the case before. William Jennings Bryan, who was the prosecutor in the famous Monkey trial, which was the great 1920s attempt to roll back the teaching of evolution, Bryant, of course, was not just a Democrat, he was a radical Democrat, who was the leader of the great populist movement in the 1890s. It's a fascinating thing. Sometimes when you read about Bryant from people on the left or liberals, you'll get the impression that there were two Bryants. There was the good Bryant, of the 1890s, and then there was his sort of wicked younger brother who somehow appeared in the 1920s with these weird religious ideas. No, he was, this was a key part of his whole movement, was the desire to defend rural Protestant America. But in the 1890s, this carried with it also a radical economic message against the capitalist elites, identified then as now with the Republican Party. So, until the 1960s, in a sense, there was, conservative religion in America didn't need to take sides between the two parties because there was a very strong streak of this in the Democratic Party as well. Also, since the evolution question had been battered down, there weren't so many specific hot-button issues that would stir conservative religion up. But, as I've always said, Franklin Delano Roosevelt almost certainly could not have been elected. Well, he couldn't even have been selected by the Democratic Party in those days. He certainly couldn't have been elected in the country as a whole, even in the depths of the Great Depression, on a platform even tangentially associated with gay marriage and abortion. Now, you might say, well, but for God's sake, that was 1932. Haven't we moved on a bit? Well, the answer is some of us have, and some of us haven't. A very large section of American society has not moved on in that way. And in its view, why should it? We believe in the same God we always believed in, he has the same beliefs and principles. But the rest of the world can change, but we're not going to. And I think that it is very important to recognise that, because this is something which does seem alien to us in Europe now, that if indeed you do have a very strong and passionate religious faith, and if that faith has certain pretty concrete instructions about what you can and cannot do, that is inevitably going to have a strong effect on your political behaviour. As long as we had that in Europe, it had that effect in Europe. They still have it in large parts of America, so it still has the same effect on them. And from this point of view, two things need to be recognised, I think. One is that, of course, since the 1960s, this world, you don't have to be paranoid in this world of conservative religion in America to think that modern culture is out to get you, because it is out to get you. That's one. The second thing is, of course, that if you believe very fervently in this, then in a way it is natural to have the attitude which a landlady of mine in America once expressed about the Democrats. And she said, a very nice woman, and she said, of course, I hope I don't offend you in any way, and said, but, if somebody doesn't believe in God, I'm afraid I just can't trust them in any other way. Well, fair enough, right? But, so the perception that the Democrats don't believe in God, something, of course, which Democratic presidential contenders have to do their absolute utmost to deny, but which, you see perfectly well if you look at the cultural world of much of the Democrats, Hollywood and so forth, is something which has contributed enormously to polarising American politics. Because, well, exactly, if you are a really fervent believer, then, well, to put it bluntly, an atheist is going to hell. You cannot elect as president somebody who's going to hell. That would be, to put it mildly, contradictory, right? We won't even get into the whole business of, Obama as Antichrist and so forth, which is believed, on the wilder shores of this, but so very much wilder. So, you have there, in this tradition, this combination of beliefs that you need to adopt certain cultural forms to be a true American, and that these cultural forms are under attack. Now, this is no longer necessarily explicitly racist in terms of colour. That has gone down a great deal, as one can see from the fact that Obama was elected at all, which obviously wouldn't have been possible even a couple of decades ago. What I think, however, you see is a transformation in America from what I call in the book, what many others have called a Herrenvolk democracy, a master race democracy, in which only members of a certain race, a race which has a way of changing over time, but which is was always racially defined, can play an important role in politics, to what I call civilizational empire, which makes America in a way, in its own way, like the Romans and the Chinese of old, which is to say, actually anybody can become a citizen of the empire and can rise to the highest ranks. That both the Prime Minister of China and its most famous poet under the Tang dynasty were both Turks by origin. But you have to adopt the imperial culture and worship the imperial gods. And if you do that, it's fine, and speak the language and everything else. But if you don't, there is absolutely no diminution of hostility to the barbarians beyond the gate, or the unassimilated barbarians within. And from that point of view, for me the great surprise about Obama's election was not that a black would be elected president, because I expected that to happen sooner or later, but I always expected the first black president of the United States to be a military veteran, because that has been one of the absolutely archetypal ways by which certain blacks, like Colin Powell, for example, have gained acceptance from the white mainstream in America, and even from conservative whites, because they have demonstrated their patriotism, their adherence to American values. And this is something where even conservative filmmakers, in fact, especially conservative filmmakers in Hollywood, like Clint Eastwood, have played a tremendous role. I don't know if you've seen his film Gran Torino. All about that. It's this absolutely iron-hard, die-hard conservative Marine veteran, I can't remember, or Army veteran or something, how he comes to accept these Hmong, because, well, they're just like me. They're, you know, conservative, hard-working, middle class. And there's this great scene, shows he has a sense of humour, even if his latest appearance may suggest he's losing it. But anyway, in which, if you've seen Gran Torino, in which sort of archetypal Clint Eastwood thing from his great film, The Outlaw Josie Wales, which was also about assimilation in a curious way, in which he spits, you see. And so in this latest film, Gran Torino, he spits off his porch, and this Hmong grandmother on the next porch to him outspits him. And you see this look of sort of shocked respect in his eyes. So, Hmong, they can become Americans. And the story of the film, as you know if you've seen it, is about him combining with the good Hmong against these low-life Hmong gangsters and drug dealers and so forth. So you assimilate and then you come together multiracially, but against, of course, the outside, the ones who refuse assimilation. And Obama has had the problem here, I think, is, I mean, obviously his colour continues subliminally to raise all sorts of anxieties. But in a way, he's got the worst of both worlds, and that, I think, has also affected his inability to adopt more radical policies. Because if he adopts more radical policies, then he is tarred as a... Well, I mean, actually, he's tarred already, so maybe he might as well not have bothered. As a Black Panther sympathiser, as somebody who's going to steal hard-working whites' wages and give them to a shiftless black underclass. And that, of course, is a deep hostility among many whites. But if he does what he in effect has done, which is assimilate himself completely to the old white liberal elites, then he gets it in the neck from the white working classes and middle classes as a liberal elitist and a product of the East Coast, even if he's from Chicago, went to Harvard and so forth. And then you get the other side of this, which is the liberal elites. They don't believe in God, they're atheists, they're un-Americans, they even like the French, which is why, of course, my line about parallels with French nationalism went down so particularly badly. So, I think you see in the Tea Party movement, this latest wave of radicalisation in the Republican Party, a fascinating coming together yet again, but in ways that would certainly not have surprised Gunnar Myrdal or Lewis Hartz or Hofstadter, of these two traditions, the fanatical belief, civic nationalist belief in the Constitution, but imbued also with these deep anxieties. Now, something which has often been there in the surface driving this, but which has become more and more salient over the past 40 years, which does link these movements to others in Europe in the past and in, of course, different ways in Europe today, and which is, in my view, terribly dangerous, is the way in which these latest waves of radicalisation have also reflected the economic and social decline of large sections of the middle classes. Middle classes in America also, of course, indicating working classes, or at least what we would have called in the past the respectable working classes. I don't know quite how one phrases that politically correctly today, but anyway. And here, once again, the notion that these classes are in decline is not paranoid, alas. This has become apparent for a number of decades, especially the deeply sinister phenomenon that even when the economy itself has grown, a smaller and smaller proportion of this has gone to much of the middle classes, you know, the socio-economic differentiation of America, which has been so widely marked. But of course, over the past 4 years, it's not simply a question of getting a smaller and smaller share of the pie, it's also, you know, we have seen a radical, I mean, a really sharp and frightening decline in living standards. And insofar as this reflects deep patterns in the world economy, which it may not be possible for a US administration now to do anything about, this is deeply troubling. Because, as I said in the first edition of the book, and I sort of remind people that I did say it, historically it's been, you know, the return of prosperity and the reality of the American dream, as far as, you know, the mass of the population is concerned, which has played such a role in, you know, preventing the continuous radicalisation of sections of the American population, bringing America, of putting into motion what I've called America's great self-correcting mechanism, historically, of bringing it back to moderation and democratic stability. If that no longer works, then for the reasons I've set out in this lecture and I set out in the book, there are deep traditions of really, in some respects, rather frightening radical conservatism and extremist ideas in sections of the United States. That's one thing. The other thing is that I have a nasty feeling that we are seeing again something which we've seen in the past, or we risk seeing again, which is to say the American Constitution becoming an instrument and a battleground for racial politics. Something, of course, which was so true of the South twice, in the years leading up to the American Civil War and in the 1950s and early 60s, the attempt to use aspects of the Constitution, and especially, of course, its federal aspects, to block rights for blacks in the South and in the United States. Now, what one sees today, I fear, is not that. It's something different, though related to that above all in terms of states' rights, which is that I've described the adherence of the Tea Party to the letter of the Constitution as irrational, particularly because of this categorical rejection of any amendments to it. Despite the fact that not only is this, after all, a late 18th century document, but also it has been amended, and even quite significantly, a number of times. The word, and this, you know, I think this extraordinary attachment to the letter of the Constitution has caused considerable bewilderment, even among some liberal Americans, let alone outside. There is a point to this, however, which is that, as has been widely remarked, the strangest aspect of the US Constitution from a democratic point of view is not just the rules of the US Senate, which give these extraordinary blocking powers to small numbers of senators, but the composition of the US Senate. 2 senators for every state. 2 senators for Wyoming, with less than 600,000 people. 2 senators for California, with almost 40 million people. And so it goes. I have it somewhere, I can't remember what this means, how many Californians have to vote for a senator compared to how many Wyomings. But the point is, this does give wholly disproportionate power to a small number of overwhelmingly white conservative states in the Midwest and the West, and to a lesser extent in the South. There, of course, the states are bigger. Now, if you are afraid, as you should be if you see things in these terms, which I of course don't, but anyway, if you are genuinely afraid of the fact that, as all the demographers appear to be certain by now, the Anglo-whites will cease to be a majority and become a plurality, well, actually not Anglo-whites, whites in general, by the middle years of the century. If you are deeply troubled by the enormously growing Latino population in particular, but some others as well, then the last thing that you are going to do is suggest that the Constitution should be amended. Because if you start with a sort of small thing, which elsewhere would have passed almost without notice, like, for example, extending presidential terms from 4 to 5 or 6 years, so you get away from this constant campaigning, and so forth, you would be worried that you could not then avoid, sooner or later, exploring the most strange, from a democratic point of view, aspect, which, as I say, is the composition of the Senate, and you're not going to do that because it gives you tremendous power. But I want to end on too pessimistic a note. A situation in which an upper house with tremendous powers to block legislation and even to play an executive role in some respects is less and less representative of a different racial reality in the country, is not a recipe for effective government in future, or for consensual democracy. Now, I've talked about America's great self-correcting mechanism, and I do deeply, deeply hope that that will kick in again. Whether it will kick in, however, without a transformation in the present economic fortunes of the white middle classes, is, to put it mildly, an open question. Thank you.
We have about 15-20 minutes for questions on this very interesting, provocative discussion about the US political system, and do extend it also to some of the recent developments as well in the US elections, or foreign policy.
And foreign policy,
Foreign policy as well. So please, the gentleman there, and I think we have got a
microphone.
Could people hear?
Barbara, do you want to be in charge of microphone? Congratulations.
You could all hear me, could you, at the back? Yeah, okay.
I had a question related to what Governor Romney said last night. I don't know if you're aware of
the 47% line. Yeah.
Do you have any comment to make on that?
Bloody stupid to say it on video, I'll say that. But yes, I mean, it reflects an attitude, which is to say, which has so often been said about the United States, and which, people fear this effect may be happening now in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. That one of the reasons you could accept, thanks to FDR for a few decades, you could never get a welfare state going in America in quite the same way, is that a very large chunk of the American population regards the people who would be recipients of aid as essentially not part of them, as different, as alien, as threatening, and above all as undeserving. Now, I'm aware Romney was a damn fool to let that be heard, but also in a way a damn fool to think it, is that thanks to Ryan, more and more of his natural voters have been reminded that yes, they're white, yes, they're middle classes, but yes, they are also recipients of welfare, even if they don't call it that, in the form, of course, of Medicare and Social Security. And I think, the risk there is that, you know, if you know, you must have seen this sort of curious thing among some Tea Party supporters, this line, oh, but Medicare and Social Security, that's not welfare. Welfare's for blacks. But this is our right, you know, because we're... And anyway, there's this weird idea in some of them that isn't actually government. It's, well, I know, it comes from God or something. But I think Ryan, by suggesting that these things should be abolished, has reminded them that actually, no, it is welfare, and they depend on it. And so... You know, the point being, this is the old attitude, oh, well, you know, the 47% of low-lifes who probably don't vote anyway, so they can go to hell. But what if the 47% is actually 77%, or even 87%? You don't want to remind people of that, because you'll lose.
In your definition of American creed, do you have a view about whether, if it was accepted, it would change America's investments abroad, particularly in terms of investment in places like Israel and South Africa and the Far East? So it becomes a retrenchment policy?
So, sorry, I don't quite...
If America follows the philosophy that might come about, so it becomes Fortress America, would that change, in your view, its external investment criteria?
Well, the American creed is not about Fortress America. I mean, on the contrary, the creed as such has been about... or has been used to justify America going out and spreading democracy. That's why I talked about, you know, Bush gaining the support for a while of a certain number of convinced liberals with his line that it's America's right and duty and ability to spread democracy in the Middle East, if by force, if necessary. The Fortress America line is actually comes more from the other tradition that I was talking about, you know, the idea of America as an embattled, democratic, white culture surrounded by racial enemies. Now, there is a... Yes, I mean, there is a streak of isolationism in this sort of radical conservative tradition in America. A very good book which sort of unpicks these different strands in the tradition. I disagree with him politically, but I like his analysis, is by Walter Russell Mead, Special Providence, about different cultural strands in American foreign policy. The problem there is, though, that unlike perhaps at times in the past, very, very few people in the Tea Parties, for example, are consistent isolationists. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that it would by any means necessarily be a good thing if America was isolationist. Because at the same time they're what Mead calls Jacksonian nationalists, which is to say they distrust the outside world. They're very suspicious of alliances with the outside world, which commit America to defend these unworthy foreigners. But they will react with ferocious violence if they see America as being attacked or even being insulted. If you read the works of Sarah Palin, Michelle Bachmann and people, that comes out very strongly. They know nothing about foreign affairs, but they know that America should kick ass in principle. Indeed, that's the only thing that Palin says about foreign affairs in her book, that America should kick ass. Whose ass, it seems? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't just kick them, you know. Now, of course, you mentioned Israel. What is, of course, very striking is that for a great many of these people, Israel and the United States are seen essentially as the same country by now. And that means you shouldn't necessarily kick everybody's ass who Israel says you should kick, but you should certainly let Israel kick whoever it likes and whenever it likes.
Yeah, in regards to what you said earlier about the religiosity of American politics, with this demographic upswing in the Latino population, are we to expect a growing of the religious aspect of American politics, or we to expect something different, or even a downswing? But I mean, obviously, I doubt that, considering the massive Catholic.
Yeah. Well, there has been one line in the Republican Party for a good many years now, which is to say that we must appeal to the Latinos because so many of them are culturally conservative Catholics and share our Protestant, conservative, Christian attitudes to gay marriage and abortion and all these things. But that, and of course you have had, well, at least since McCarthy, not necessarily before, a very strong conservative, politically conservative streak in American Catholicism. Wasn't necessarily true earlier than that. But I think what you're seeing with the Latinos is what you saw previously with Irish Catholicism in America, which is that conservative culture is trumped politically by economics. And of course, in the case of the Latinos, above all by the immigration issue. In other words, the Republican attempt in this regard has been completely wrecked by the stronger and stronger public Republican opposition to immigration and the harsher and harsher means being demanded to crack down on immigration. And that leaves the Catholic hierarchy in America in a very difficult position, and I think has been largely responsible for neutralising them politically. This is a Catholic hierarchy which in the past had used to have very powerful Catholic hierarchy in America.
Sorry about that.
It's God.
It's my fault.
It's either God or it's not Max Weber, is it?
It could be Max Weber.
No, I think
he's
seriously unhappy with me. But I think that is likely to continue because, the increasing fear of the white Republican base is going to make it very difficult to appeal to Latinos. On the other hand, of course, because there is this feeling among many Latinos, which is exactly the feeling you get among so many blacks, and has its reasons, that actually neither of the parties is going to do anything for us, so we may as well not vote. But I think the Republicans have done a great deal recently to diminish that feeling and make sure that, no, they will vote, and they'll vote for the Democrats, even if they have no great confidence in the Democratic economic program. It's still better than what the Republicans are offering the Latinos, which could be very harsh indeed. Just one qualification to that, though, which is, what's a Latino? On the whole business of cultural assimilation, it's fascinating, especially, because I spent some time in the US when I was a kid and then went back after a long interval to live. And when I was visiting some sort of fundamentalist churches as a kid, they were all white, every face. Now, if you watch them, the religious television channels, and especially, of course, in Texas and other states, you will see more than a sprinkling of Latino faces, Asian faces, and so on. Now, in the case of the Latinos, and actually some of the Asians as well, that's because of the role of the Protestant fundamentalist missionaries in the Far East and in Latin America. But it's also because, if you travel down there, if you are an aspiring member of the establishment in Texas and you come from another race, what is the path to acceptance by the existing establishment? Join the church, a fundamentalist church, and you will be accepted now.
I've been doing some studies abroad as well, and I've been in the United States for an extensive period of time. And the observation I've made while I've been there is that the Republican Party is not something you can just say, well, you think this way or you think that way, or the same with Democrats. You have rhinos and you have diners, and I'm just thinking, when you're saying the Republican Party has swung very, very far to the right, I'm just curious what you think of what Chris Christie, he actually said at the Republican National Convention in Tampa, Florida, when he was talking as governor of New Jersey in connection with the Republican nomination for Mitt Romney and of the more moderate members of the Republican silent majority.
Well, you're absolutely right, of course. The Republicans, do contain significantly different elements still. But, as I say, if you look at past Republican programs, at least, from the 1950s on, which after all is, some 60 years in the past now, I think you have certainly seen a very significant shift. Not of everybody, but with regard to a range of issues. And, of course, what you have seen with Tea Parties as well is a pretty systematic, once again, not universally successful, but often successful, knocking out of what they would call, rhinos, Republicans in name only, or what others would call moderate or centrist Republicans. Even some very distinguished, very famous, and in the wider population, very popular Republican figures like Dick Lugar, for example, being actually knocked out in the Republican primaries by much more populist, radical, conservative forces. Now, once again, that doesn't mean that they actually select the presidential candidate. Romney, of course, comes from absolutely the old hereditary centrist Republican tradition. And, of course, the Tea Party tradition, or the Christian right before them, were not allowed simply to select the candidate because ultimately the party knew that if they did that, they'd lose because they'd alienate the centre. And the only time that they did that, to an extent, was with Gingrich's Republican Revolution in the 1990s, and lo and behold, they lost as a result by alienating centrist voters. But at the same time, I think you can see from so many of Romney's own positions, you only have to compare Romney's positions on a number of issues with those of his father, when his father was in politics. And of course you can look at Romney's running mate and so forth. Or you can look at McCain, another hereditary establishment Republican. And then you can look at some of the things he felt obliged to say, the positions he had to change, and look at his running mate, by God, to see that even if the old guard is still hanging on, in positions of power, they have had to modify their positions very, very considerably, in response to these upsurges from below. Now, on the other hand, of course, what is worth noting is, and this also explains the hatred of Washington and the mood of frustration and the deep belief in treachery and treason on the more, the radical right and in the Tea Party thing, is that, of course, most of their policies, however, never in fact get adopted, or they're adopted rhetorically, but they're never adopted in practice. Either because they don't have policies, the return to the Constitution is not a policy, or because it just can't be done without wrecking the entire economy, or because it can't be done because ultimately you can't stop the immigration and so forth and so on, or it can't be done because how in the end do you roll back modern culture, at least without bringing in savage censorship laws, which they themselves would then denounce as an aspect of autocracy and big government. But the fact that they elect people who promise to do all these things, and then they get to Washington and they don't do them year after year, generation after generation, increases, this or really fuels this constant thing on the radical right, which is, our elites have betrayed us. They go to Washington and they're co-opted by liberalism. What happens, of course, is they go to Washington and they're co-opted by reality, or, of course, by capitalism, by the capitalist elites telling them, we'll accept this, we won't accept that, we need immigration, etc., etc. But that very much fuels the conspiracy belief on the right, the belief in treachery. And by the way, another French parallel, which didn't go down too well, I say that so much of the spirit of these radical conservatives was summed up by Charles Maurras, the not exactly a fascist, but close to it, 70 years or 80 years ago or so, he wrote that, yes, I'm a French patriot, but to love France today, it is necessary to hate what she has become. Very much the spirit of, the spirit of radical conservatism throughout history, but very much to be observed on the radical right in America as well.
I think we have time for one more question. I think
yes,
at the back, yeah.
My name is Moses, I'm a fresher. I don't really think I should be behind this mic. I was told today by my tutor not to be afraid.
No need to be afraid of me.
Here's one from the conspiracist hotline. While I was on YouTube trying to find out if Obama indeed is an antichrist,
whether he is the antichrist.
I came across something that was about the North American Alliance. I think it was Mexico, Canada, and America coming together to form a union, the economies.
NAFTA.
Yeah. And to come up with the currency as the Amero. I don't know if that's true.
No.
Or not.
No.
Okay, that's what I wanted to do.
I'll say just something on the difference to Antichrist. On the currency, many Americans are convinced that sooner or later, and I don't want to alarm any Canadians in the audience, but that they will swallow Canada, and of course, you'll have the dollar will become the Canadian currency. The chances of the United States tying its currency intimately to the peso are not great for the foreseeable future. On Antichrist, all I'd like to say, there's a wonderful book on this whole tradition in America called When Time Shall Be No More by Paul Boyer on the apocalyptic tradition in American culture and politics. He begins rather charmingly, he's dead now, alas, he was a great man. In his preface, he writes that after many years studying this tradition in America, I feel I should put my thoughts down on paper while I'm still of comparatively sound mind. And anyway, he traces this tradition, but what you can read in Boyer is that if Obama is the Antichrist, and of course I wouldn't dream of issuing a definitive version of that, it's hardly my place to do so, but all I will say is that if he is the Antichrist, and he goes along to the Antichrist Club, which, in the view of the people who believe in Antichrist, will almost certainly be in New York, or possibly Paris. In future it'll be Beijing, it was Moscow, but New York's been pretty much of a constant for a long time now, and Paris. Anyway, so he goes along to the Antichrist Club, and he finds, well, there are two things. One, which isn't so good for Obama, because he'll find it pretty damn crowded. On the other hand, he might find a good deal of the company fairly congenial, because Gorbachev has been the Antichrist, and, well, no, but of course it's true that Stalin would be there. Mao was the Antichrist for a while, Jack Kennedy was the Antichrist for a while, Abraham Lincoln was the Antichrist, naturally, in the view of part of the South. In other words, to a remarkable extent, this is a tradition which has identified particular people as the Antichrist, and has produced chapter and verse from the book of Revelations to show that this is the case. And then, when they haven't, as you might say, quite come up to the mark, has dropped them and chosen another Antichrist. So they're all sitting there, presumably, all these ex-Antichrists and failed Antichrists, around a glass of white wine in Paris, smoking a joint, no doubt. And well, most of them having a very good time, of course, with the exception of Stalin. But given that the character of most of the Antichrists, I expect they voted Stalin out of the club. So I think, fine.
I think at that point we do have a little celebration where we can join some
white
of the
wine.
White wine.
I'm so sorry.
But I really just like to, to say thank you to Anatol for this really very stimulating lecture. American politics, we do sometimes think we understand it because we get such a lot of it on TV. It's a culture which is similar, linguistically at least, to the United Kingdom. But as those who will be studying comparative politics, and where the US is one of the countries, it's actually a very difficult country to understand well. Political culture is different, and there's complex ways in which it relates to political life and to foreign policy as well. And I think it's been very much a revelation to start thinking about this, particularly with the elections coming up. Now, I think we have now drinks. Can we go directly? The drinks are taking place in the deep end, which is on the ground floor, and then you go down, you'll find it, I think, the area with their drinks. And just to say a big thank you to Anatol